So let me call the proceedings to order. My name is David Hart. I am the director of the Clean Energy Innovation Policy Program at ITIF. ITIF is a think tank based here in Washington, D.C. that focuses on science and technology policy, a range of issues, including clean energy. And it's a great pleasure to have Representative Reed here to kick off our discussion of tax credits and clean energy. He's a longtime friend of ITIF, or we should say we're friends with him, and we really appreciate your staff setting up the room for us, so we're grateful to you for that, despite its occasional flaws. So Representative Reed sits on the Ways and Means Committee, and he's best known to us as a great friend of manufacturing. But we're here today to talk about clean energy, where he's taken a leadership position, and I'm just going to turn the floor over to him for a few minutes.
Well, thank you. There you want me up?
Wherever you want to stand, we don't, actually, we should
go there. I got the cameras and stuff. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glad we're able to get the room for you. I wish looks like it needs to be a little bit bigger. Standing room only, great. So what, are you having a technical problem?
I just had to switch the display.
Yeah, it's blame the Russian. No, it's just
There's really nothing going on today, so nothing else on the
docket here today. So I am actually very honored to be here to talk about clean energy and innovation. So, well, first of all, thank you, David, for the kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this morning to be with us in regards to this issue, in regards to energy development, energy production, and clean energy in particular. And we love the folks at ITIF. You guys do great work. And no, we will always have our door wide open to you. We look forward to the discussion today. And what I wanted to maybe talk to you today about is something that's near and dear to my heart. You know, as we deal with the issues across the street, just left the floor, you know, obviously a historic day here in Washington, D.C. in regards to a vote that will be happening here later this afternoon. But, you know, what I wanted to focus on today is not that partisan politics, not the political issue that's overtaken this community for the foreseeable future, but something where we can hopefully unite Republicans and Democrats. You know, I come to you today as a Republican member of the Ways and Means Committee, and I will tell you, Republicans are embracing the idea that we have to do something on climate, that we have to put forward our ideas of how we are going to solve the issue of climate change and what are we going to do about it going forward. And one of the sweet spots that I have found in my tenure here in Washington since 2010 is when we talk about this issue of climate, we can spend a lot of time discussing the causes, the who's, the what's, and that type of thing. But if you talk to folks that maybe who are not generally receptive to this discussion, and you actually sit with them, and you actually listen to where they're coming from, like I have in regards to folks that maybe aren't in the same position that I am on this issue, I say, well, look, you set all that stuff aside. Do you agree that we want clean air? Yes. I haven't yet to have a member of Congress or anybody that's opposed to me say, yo, I want to fight for dirty air. Do you want clean water for your kids and your grandchildren? Yes, I want to do that. Do you want to have an energy supply that you know, you don't have to be dependent upon the geopolitical issues of the world, the oil wars and things like that? And they're like, yeah, I like that idea of being energy secure in regards to it. So if you can put that conversation together, it is amazing after we've had that conversation how many folks that were not potentially or particularly in our tent on this issue, they say, well, Tom, what you're working on, I can agree with you. And as we've demonstrated to you, hopefully over the years, being a Republican member of the Ways and Means Committee, you know, we got the Solar Champion Legislator of the Year award in 2016. I fought for the wind and the solar ITC and PTC. Been strong promoter of alternative and renewable energy sources. So hopefully we've come into this room with some credibility, and I encourage folks to come together. And one area that I think we can come together on is something I'm working on here called the Energy Sector Innovation Credit Act. This is a piece of legislation that's been floated around. We have been working on it for 3 years plus. And if you watched a hearing that we had recently in the Ways and Means Committee about, I guess it was about 3 months ago, where we had a panel of members, or not members, but experts, if you would, that spoke to the committee. And when you went down each one of the witnesses, one of the common denominators of their position on this issue of climate change and what can we do in the energy sector is one of the key solutions here is going to be based on Americans' innovation. It is going to be based on the good old-fashioned ingenuity of American know-how. It is going to be based on the ideas that Americans in particular around the world have demonstrated the ability to come up with the solutions of the generations that they faced, the crises that they had within their generation. And so that's what the energy sector innovation tax credit is all about. It, to me, is a proposal that is rooted in the idea that we can have a conversation about mandates. We can have a conversation about regulatory bodies trying to set these standards for emissions, these standards of production, and things like that. And that's a legitimate debate, and I'll leave that for another day, another arena. But if you don't have the technology, if you don't have the innovation in order to meet those standards, to meet those regulatory frameworks, then those are just paper tigers. They are a false sense of security that potentially people can point to and say, hey, we did something on this issue. But if you actually cannot get to that standard because you don't have the technology, you don't have the innovation available to you, then I think we would all agree, I would hope we would all agree, well then we got to do something about that innovation and that technology. And that's the heart of the Energy Sector Innovation Tax Credit Act. What it does is it says to everyone, God bless you, God bless you. What it says to everyone is essentially we're not going to pick winners and losers from Washington, D.C. We're going to have a tech-neutral approach on this. And what we're going to do is we're going to encourage innovation from tax incentives that will essentially say, you know what, if you can show that you're producing better energy, cleaner energy, more efficient and effective energy sources, and you have an innovative type of technology that's coming through the pipeline, we want to stand with you as tax writers, as legislators, and get you from what is only provable on a piece of paper or in the lab, and get you through that valley of death so that you can become self-sustaining, you can become commercially viable on your own 2 feet, because that's what will change the needle. That is what will make a mark on the world. You know, I was recently with Bill Gates and talking to him and some other folks in regards to this area, and they're investing billions of dollars in regards to this area. And you know, he talked about, as we go around the world, if we don't innovate and create the technology that can become cost effective, so that when that village in India, that village in China, is selecting what power source they want to put electricity to their homes, to their communities. And these folks are living in squalor. These folks are living in a state that we are not accustomed to here in America, and they want to have a better life for themselves and their children. How can we tell them, you know what, we're not going to give you this technology and innovation because it doesn't exist. We're not going to encourage that out of America. We want them to be able to make the choice that says, you know what, this is a cost-effective choice. It's a good thing for the environment, and it's a good thing for the community. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do with this credit. Not only in America to develop this innovative new technology so that we can produce this better energy, this cleaner energy, but so when that decision maker in China, in India, around the globe can say to their communities, you know what, we're going to purchase that innovative technology rather than a plug-and-play coal plant. We're going to have a plug-and-play XYZ. And because we can afford it, we can easily make that decision as a community. That will move the needle, in my opinion. And so that's what we're proposing. That's what we have worked hard over the last 3 years to get bipartisan support. We have bicameral feelers out in regards to bicameral folks in the Senate that want to join with us to do this. We have already secured bipartisan support on the committee. We already have secured bipartisan support off the committee on this bill. So stay tuned as we go into the new year. We are going to be a champion of innovation in our office and these members, because it's through innovation and that American ingenuity that will actually tackle this world crisis of the climate. And without that ingenuity, I'm afraid that what we will just be doing is arguing, debating, and putting together paper tigers that really carry no weight. So with that said, I thank you for your efforts, and know we will be here with you always, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your talking.
All right, take care. care, guys.
Thank you so much, Representative Reed. We really appreciate your coming over and
Take care.
look
Hey, Jim,
forward to
how are
your
you?
work in the future.
Salute.
So I'm going to turn the podium over to Dorothy Robine, who's our moderator today. Dorothy is a member of the ITIF board, and she served in senior positions in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, including with the Department of Defense and General Service Administration dealing with energy issues. And then I would particularly commend to you her report that she did for ITIF last year with Jeff Marthesy on how the Department of Defense can contribute to civilian clean energy innovation. And we're really thrilled to have her as our moderator today. So thank you.
Of course. Thanks, David. Great to be here. So this is an incredibly timely event looking at the tax incentives for clean energy innovation. I heard a former colleague from the Clinton White House on NPR this morning talking about what's in the tax extenders package, and that's in the papers, what is and what is not in there. So we're going to spend an hour and a half talking about that. Two of our speakers, David Hart and Elizabeth Knoll, will present their new report on this topic. And our other two experts, Steve Capana and Jeremy Harrell, will comment on the report and discuss related congressional activity. I will briefly introduce the speakers in just a minute, but let me just say why I think this is such an important issue very quickly. First, the federal government spending on energy tax incentives, tax credits, really dwarfs the spending on other forms of spending on energy technology development. And David will go through some of those numbers, but it really is, it really causes you to step back and say, wow, that is really, to use Willie Sutton's phrase, that is where the money is, and it's growing. It's a large number, and it's growing at least the amount going for clean energy tax incentives. Second, as Representative Reed said, it's an area where it's possible to get bipartisan support, particularly insofar as the focus is on innovation. So there is a potential sweet spot there. And third, this issue to me is sort of a master class in the political impediments to trying to do sensible economic policy reform. And the terms that you'll hear this morning, windfalls and unintended consequences and rent seeking, all of these are things that impede trying to move some of these policy tools in a more sensible direction. Now, our speakers this morning have worked at that intersection of the politics and economics of clean energy policy, including tax incentives, energy-related tax incentives. David Hart is a professor in the Scar School of Public Policy at George Mason University and director of the Center for Science, Technology, and Innovation at SCAR. He also leads the Clean Energy Program at ITIF, and ITIF's publications, David's and his small team's publications in this clean energy innovation space, white papers, op-eds, congressional testimony, are a testament to the value of rigorous, timely, and well-written policy analysis. David's latest book is Unlocking Energy Innovation, co-authored with MIT's Richard Lester. Our second presenter, Elizabeth Knoll, is a consultant on energy and environmental issues with EMN Strategies here in Washington, D.C. She previously spent 5 years with the National Resources Defense Council, most recently as the Legislative Director for Energy and Transportation. And prior to NRDC, she spent 3 years with the American Gas Association. Our third speaker, Steve Capana, am I pronouncing that right?
Pretty close. Capana.
Capana, all right, Steve Capana, serves as Director for U.S. Climate Policy and Analysis at the Environmental Defense Fund. Steve spent prior to going to EDF about a year ago, he spent more than 6 years in the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, beginning as a presidential management fellow and then coming back later in a position including Director of Strategic Priorities and Impact Analysis. Prior to his time as a presidential management fellow, which included a year at the Council on Environmental Quality working on energy efficiency issues, he spent 5 years at the Alliance to Save Energy. And our final speaker is Jeremy Harrell, who is the Managing Director of Policy with the ClearPath Foundation. ClearPath's mission is to develop and advance free market ideas that accelerate clean energy innovation. Before he joined ClearPath, Jeremy spent about a decade on Capitol Hill, both in the House and Senate. Most recently, he worked for Dean Hill of Nevada, focusing on Senator Hill's activities on two big committees, Energy and Natural Resources, and Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So the structure for today's event, David and Elizabeth will spend a total of about 20 minutes presenting their report. Then Steve and Jeremy will each have about 10 minutes to comment on the report or talk about related issues. Then we'll talk amongst ourselves for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. We are not live streaming this event, but it will be video archived. Okay.
Trying not to kill ourselves up here with all the cables, none of which are working. So thanks everybody for coming today. I know it's a quiet day up here on Capitol Hill. There's nothing else going on. It's a quiet week generally. So as Dorothy mentioned, I'm David Hart, and I teach at George Mason University and run the Clean Energy Program at ITIF. We're not able to project our slides, but there are some copies floating around. If you have one, I will do my best to follow you along. A friend of mine just told me I should paint pictures with words, so I will try to do that for the rest of you. If you're able to access the internet, you can also, I think, download the slides from the itif.org website. So we'll take about 20 minutes. We're going to split it evenly, roughly. Elizabeth and I will tell you about the report, which you can grab a copy of outside or download as well. And we welcome your feedback and comments on that. So yeah, if you're following along, I can't even change the computer. I'm going to go to slide number 4 here. So I wrote a short piece in the summer comparing carbon prices with tax incentives. So a lot of the policy in this area is framed around carbon prices, and you'll hear some of that from our speakers. Bill Nordhaus, the economist who won the Nobel Prize last year for his work on climate change, once said that a carbon price is necessary and sufficient for addressing this problem. All the rest is fluff. We don't agree with that position, and in fact, to be fair to Bill, he backed off of that later on. But we specifically disagree with the effectiveness of carbon pricing into driving innovation, which, as Representative Reed said, is really a crucial part of solving the climate challenge. So we see carbon pricing and tax incentives, which help to drive innovation, as complementary. And in this piece, I made an analogy between carbon prices, which are like sandpaper, and tax incentives, which are more like a saw. So carbon prices have the effect of shifting people's decisions about everything they do that uses energy. And they can induce a certain amount of innovation, but it's the sort of lowest hanging fruit. They will make factories operate more efficiently. They will encourage drivers to buy more efficient vehicles. But they won't drive really radical innovation, which we need in some sectors to deal with our clean energy challenges. Tax incentives, on the other hand, are kind of more like a saw. They should be, and we'll talk about how, they should be more targeted and deal with problems more deeply. So the example that our president of ITIF, Rob Atkinson, likes to use is gas taxes. So as I'm sure many of you know, prices of gas are about twice as high in Europe as here because of the gas taxes. But they never developed electric cars in Europe until recently, right? They drove smaller cars, they drove more efficient cars compared to Americans that reflected the difference in these two prices. But really radical, paradigm-changing innovation took a lot more to bring about than simply that big differential in prices. Okay, so let me move to the next slide. So the U.S. uses tax incentives for a lot of things. A friend of mine in grad school wrote a book called The Hidden State about tax, what became known as tax expenditures, right? So the analogy between direct spending and tax incentives comes into focus when you think about them as tax expenditures. So this is revenue that the government should have received but has foregone for specific reasons. So the U.S. uses this for lots of purposes, including in energy. In fact, almost as soon as the federal income tax was allowed by the constitutional amendment, we started to see tax incentives for the oil and gas industry, which was in its sort of infancy. This is back during World War I. Some of those incentives are still around, but the tool really began to be used more aggressively in the 1970s in response to the oil crisis. So when oil prices went up, we've seen Congress kind of go into action and try to encourage other kinds of energy through incentives. So if you see on the graph here, we have data from the Congressional Research Service. Unfortunately, you can't see the subdivisions in the printout, but you can see the kind of wave that occurred in the 1970s and then dropping off again in the really troughing in the 1980s. So the price of oil went down dramatically in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan came in with his views on tax policy, and that was kind of the first wave of these tax incentives. Then in the 2000s, the price of oil starts going up again, and you see again Congress kind of kicking into gear, an even bigger wave of tax incentives that occurs in that period, including some of the ones that have been debated over the last few days, including the wind and solar credits. Although they've declined a little bit since then, it's still, as Everett Dirksen, whose name is on the Senate office building, used to say, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. This is real money. It's about $18 billion, as Dorothy mentioned, more than twice as much as the Energy Department spends on energy-related research and development. So the wind production tax credit costs the Treasury in foregone revenue about $5 billion a year. The solar investment tax credit costs about $2.5 billion a year. So these are large tax expenditures. Now, I don't mean to say that the older industries have lost their incentives. You'll see that the direct tax incentives for oil and gas have declined somewhat, but they benefit from a lot of other provisions. In the tax code, it's a little bit hard to estimate exactly what those benefits are, but something in the neighborhood of $15 billion a year. So there's a lot of money on the table here, and it could be used more effectively, and that's what our paper is about. So if you'll turn to the next slide, I guess I can draw a picture here. So imagine an S-curve. So those of you who have ever studied the diffusion of technology or pretty much any other marketing syllabus, you'll know that adoption sort of occurs slowly, and then it goes very rapidly up, and then it sort of levels out. So logistic function, for those of you who are mathematically inclined. So an S-curve, that's what we're kind of framing this against, where the the y-axis is the market share in which any technology, so whether it's a solar technology or electric vehicles or direct air capture systems, whatever technology you're thinking about, market penetration is on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. And every technology is different. Some of them take longer to be adopted. Some of them are more rapidly adopted. And the tax incentive, in our view, is meant to accelerate the kind of rapid uptake. So it fits into a sequence of policies that are most effective at different points in the curve. So when you're way on the left-hand side, when these technologies are just being developed, they're kind of crude, that's where R&D policy plays its most important role. Demonstration projects, when you get a little bit further up the curve, when the first commercial versions of these technologies are being offered. And then where we see tax incentives having their most effect is in that blanking on the, what's that? Yeah, I'm trying to think of the technical term. Anyway, the takeoff point. So when the curve gets really steep, that's when incentives have their biggest effect, and they should be removed later on. So actually, if you go to the next slide, which is exactly the same, except there's a big red oval around that takeoff point. That's the key moment, because at that point, the incentives can encourage people who just need a little bit more help to adopt that technology sooner than they might have, because prices are not coming down as fast as they might. And then that feeds back to the producers who can scale up their production and bring down prices, and it's a virtuous cycle. So tax incentives encourage adoption, adoption encourages growth of the industry leads to lower prices, and we have a more rapid process of diffusion and innovation, which is what this policy is all about. However, when you get past a certain point, those benefits disappear. Or I should say, they don't disappear, but they don't accrue to the public anymore. They really accrue to the producers. And when a technology matures, most of that sort of acceleration has occurred. The learning has been received by the industry, and rather than subsidizing new adoption, you're really just subsidizing either consumers or producers rather than encouraging faster adoption. So these incentives should be temporary, whereas a carbon price should be permanent, because the environmental damage being done by carbon emissions never goes away. And the confusion between these two tools has really made the debate difficult. And I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion. So one challenge is getting the timing right in terms of the maturity of the technology. But a second is having a stable policy that sends the right signal to the market. So now I'm to the bottom here. There's a graph here from the National Renewable Energy Lab that shows the ups and downs of the wind production tax credit. So in addition to having challenges getting the timing right in terms of the maturity of the technology, Congress also has trouble sending a stable signal. So these tax credits, unfortunately, have come and gone in the code. Sometimes they get retroactively extended, including apparently some yesterday that were retroactively extended. This does not send a very clear signal to the market, either to consumers, but particularly to producers. And you can see in the response, so this graph shows the ups and downs of the wind industry in response to the production tax credit. It tends to encourage booms and busts, because the industry wants to grab the credit while it's available, and then it goes away, and then you have a kind of drop in activity. So it's important to hit the takeoff point, and then to send a clear signal, and then hopefully to ramp down the credit in a way that the market can anticipate and plan for. And that's really what Representative Reed was talking about with his bill. So that's the kind of theoretical background. I've talked a little bit about what we've seen in practice, but I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth to talk more about that. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for being here this morning. Put things down. It's been a lot of fun working with David on this. He's got the professor, vibe and doing all the theory, and then it's been. Then I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the case studies that we have in the report, and kind of how these tax incentives have borne out over the past few decades, and. So we looked across 3 sectors: so the power sector, building sector, and transportation sector, and just kind of looked at the different tax incentives that have been in the tax code over the past few decades. So with the power sector, we predominantly focused on the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. In the building sector, we looked at the appliance manufacturing tax credit, which is no longer in the code, but 45N, as sometimes it's referred to, the energy efficient new home tax credit, or 45L, as sometimes it's referred to, and the energy efficient commercial building tax deduction, or 179D. And then in the transportation sector, we predominantly focused on the electric vehicle tax credit. And as you can see in the report, and for those of you that are familiar with tax incentives, there's a lot of criteria that are designed and developed and oftentimes embedded in the tax code. So everything from the duration, how long will the tax credits last, the beneficiary, who actually gets to receive the credit or the deduction, is there assignability, can you offer that tax credit to another entity, and then also kind of who sets the rules of the road, and that's been a bit of a challenge, the executive branch of who's actually designing and implementing and writing the rules for these credits. And I think when we look back over time, they've been incredibly successful. Like we did get a number of things right when it comes to these tax incentives. And I highlighted a couple of them in, on the slide 11. But just, I think one thing that really stood out for me as you started to look through the different credits was the role of complementary policies alongside the tax incentives. So that, we looked at, in the power sector, for instance, with the fuel cell tax credit. Initially, when the fuel cell had a tax credit, but there wasn't a commercially viable product, then the Recovery Act came into play, and there was quite a bit of funding for first-of-the-kind demonstration, and that really helped to inject, catalyze that market, and then the tax credit came along after that and helped to really bring it viable solutions into the market. And you see that across a number of the tax incentives, where the complementary policies really do help to ensure that there is a pipeline of innovation ready for to be utilized by the tax credit and move it along that S-curve as David noted. So like the new home tax incentive, when that was first established, you saw the Energy Star program and the Building America program, which are very much more on the R&D and side of things, of the demonstration side. They had, demonstrated that some of these solutions were viable, but you weren't seeing the builders take it up. And so the tax incentive allowed builders to kind of experiment and take up these new solutions that the R&D program had helped to validate. So I think one thing that really, this isn't an either or proposition, it's more that we need both of these policies and that they are very important at different stages for the technology development. The other things I think that we got right, and again, this isn't across the board, but some of the tax incentives that we saw that were technology neutral or performance based, those were very, that was a good model, a good structure. Again, with the new home tax credit, the fact that it was technology neutral allowed the builders to then decide which technology they wanted to utilize to achieve the efficiency reduction. Rather than saying, thou shalt install, X appliance, builders could innovate on their own and use the technologies that they were familiar with to achieve efficiency reductions. Performance-based, I think too, the production tax credit is very much in that space where you're motivated as a developer to try to produce more for the same cost, so that performance is then incentivized as opposed to the investment. And then I think this is one that we got right and got wrong, but in the 45M, the appliance manufacturing tax credit, we saw that over the course of the tax incentive, that a number of times the tax credit was the credit baseline was ratcheted up. So manufacturers had to continually improve to be able to receive the credit, and that allowed for continuous improvement of the technologies over time, rather than it just being stagnant and you getting the credit for the same solutions. As that improved, you saw technology improve as well. But as David has laid out, I think there's things that we got wrong, or things that have overused their useful life, we should say. So one thing that I think that the incentives that we looked at really bore out was this, the boom and bust, the fact that the tax incentives were established by Congress for a set duration, they expired, they were reinstated, they were retroactively instated, it was just the boom and bust really did not send the right signal to the market to ensure continued investment and toward a commercially viable technology and a mature market. So maybe if there had been more consistency and continuity, we would have achieved market penetration and market maturity faster, rather than the ups and downs that we've seen. The other thing that stood out was the misalignment of the incentives. So for a number of the tax credits, this is for like the PTC and ITC in particular, the beneficiary of the tax credit is a developer that doesn't have tax liability at this point necessarily. So you see the development of tax equity investments, those that do have tax liability stepping in to partner with developers, which, I think leads to inefficiencies in the delivery of the tax credit. During the Recovery Act, you could get a grant in lieu of the tax credit, which was a very short period of time, because really there wasn't a lot of tax liability out there during the Recovery Act. So, that was something that allowed developers to continually access capital, which was successful, but at the same time very expensive. So I think you have trade-offs there. Similarly, with the commercial building tax deduction, the real estate community doesn't have tax liability, so it's very hard for them to access the tax credit. And so, it's hard for them to actually utilize it and drive efficiency in commercial buildings. The other thing that I think that really stood out from the incentives that we looked at was kind of the decision-making body that is getting to set these tax credits. So, if you have to go back to Congress every few years to either make it the tax credit more stringent or extend it, it's not necessarily based on something that's like analytically rigorous. There's probably, if it were tied to a market penetration or tied to some emissions reduction criteria, you could take it outside of the political context. But because right now it's based on a time period or whatever your political capital is to go and lobby for a credit, then you end up having this, the decision-making body is based on not the actual market and how the technology is evolving. And I think then the last thing I will say that kind of leads into the principles was that, as we have seen over the years, we don't have a national energy policy, and oftentimes we use our tax statute as our energy policy to do everything. So for some folks, it's to drive emissions reductions. For others, it's to drive innovation and technology. And for others, it's to support emerging markets and emerging technologies. So I think one thing is to recognize, and David set this up well, is how we can't use our tax code for everything, or we at least need to acknowledge what it is doing right and what it is not doing right, and to what end goal. So, gonna go now to the final slide, slide 14. Just the principles that we arrived at in developing kind of next generation tax policy. And these basically are repeating some of what I've already said about where we've gotten it wrong and where we've gotten it right. But really, the first principle that we arrived at was apply tax incentives when you're approaching readiness on the S-curve, and then remove them after the target technology has had a chance to establish. So it's really important that we see strong market signals for market entry, and then also mature technologies, remove them so that new technology can come in. One very important point for number 2, absent a carbon price, absent any overarching climate policy, we are recommending applying tiered incentives. So this would really allow for new market entry, and that is reflected in some proposals that we've seen, including Representative Reed's proposal that has tiers based on market penetration. There have also been proposals within the efficiency community, like good, better, best. So you can see that you're actually could achieve higher incentives for going further, but really allowing for that differentiation in technology. Our third principle was set a broad framework, but then delegate the detailed decisions to the right body to make those determinations. So right now we're seeing problems with 45Q not having direction from Treasury, but if we send the right signals, send a broad framework, send the right signals, and have the administration, the executive agencies setting the criteria, it probably will achieve greater efficiencies and greater outcomes. The fourth principle, reward risk-taking, that's a tongue tie, by targeting tax incentives at early adopters. So this is really kind of also the beneficiary of the tax credit. They should be the ones that are incentivized to take the risk. We see with the electric vehicle tax credit, for instance, the manufacturer cap. So the companies that have innovated and have been first movers and borne a lot of that risk have now hit a cap and are no longer benefiting from that tax incentive. And so it's really penalizing that first mover for taking on that risk and moving quickly. So, we want to make sure that we're establishing tax codes that are really rewarding that risk taking as opposed to penalizing it. And then the last one was use the whole policy toolbox. And so I think this really underscores the point of we need all of the policies to achieve the decarbonization goals. We need the R&D policies that are going to help get technologies out of the labs, but we also need the incentive policies, the deployment policies to help commercialize, bridge the valley of death. But then we also really need that standard to set the floor, set the minimum requirement for emissions reductions through like a carbon price. And you need them all. They interact together. It's not one size fits all. So with that, I thank you all for coming, and I will turn it back over to you. You don't have to say it. Projecting.
I almost got out of saying this podium. Hi, everybody. I would first like to take a moment to brag about my foresight and not bothering to prepare slides. Worthwhile. So I'm going to start by just saying a few words about EDF, our sort of overall approach to climate policy and where innovation and tax incentives fit in, and then make a couple of comments that I've been, that the paper has sort of spurred in me. So EDF is a national nonprofit. We have about 2.5 million members and supporters across the country and actually across the world. We've been around since 1967. And we focus on using science, economics, and law to create innovative and effective solutions to the environmental problems of our times, one of which is climate change. In fact, that was sort of the big one at the moment. Our approach to climate policy is to have an effective, is to take an economy-wide approach with an enforceable greenhouse gas emissions reduction target and taking into account the cost of carbon emissions as the core policy mechanism. We do think that carbon policy and a carbon limit and price is really the way to go. There are obviously a number of different ways that you can address that. We are open to any of them, from a carbon tax with what we're calling an emissions integrity mechanism, which ensures that you sort of remain roughly on the path that you need to be. And the path that we think you need to be on is one that gets you to net zero emissions by 2050 in the United States. That is to be consistent with most, sort of 1.5 to 2 degree scenarios that you see from international bodies. We also would be open to a cap and trade. We've actually historically been a supporter of cap and trade, which has lost some of its policy luster over the last decade or so, but we're still holding on to it. And also potentially, an approach where you delegate responsibility to the states or delegate responsibility to executive branch agencies to sort of set how you should meet these targets. That's been our historical focus when it comes to climate policy at the national level. We've engaged in state policy and things like that, but we really have focused on the big climate policy as opposed to some of the innovation in tax incentives and complementary policies that we're talking about today. That is up until about the last few years where we've really begun to embrace the importance of innovation as well, and I think there are a couple reasons for that. One, probably the most pressing, is that the urgency of the climate crisis has become clear to us. The reason that we supported the economy-wide mechanism and focused so much on that is because we think it is the most efficient, least cost solution to carbon emissions reductions and to achieving our goals. But we also think now that we don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect solution. We need to get as many emissions reductions in the near term as we possibly can. And the second reason is the incredible bipartisan momentum that we've seen around innovation over the last few years, and really wanting to capitalize on that. That said, we do take as many opportunities as we can to point out that David mentioned White House's statement that a carbon price alone would be necessary and sufficient. And he disagrees with that. I think at this point we would disagree with that as well. I think you do need complementary policies and innovation. On the other hand, I also think innovation alone is not necessary and sufficient, and I think there's a risk in some of the conversations that are happening today that we can sort of gloss over that fact and can get caught up in the positive spirit of innovation. But I worry that we can make some progress in innovation and still fall well short of our carbon emissions goals. This really is a very daunting challenge, and we need all the tools available in our toolboxes, one of the previous speakers said. So innovation overall is really important. It's good timing today to be able to talk after the appropriations bill that came in yesterday. I think we saw very robust appropriations numbers, which we're really happy for in clean energy across the Department of Energy. My old office, EDRE, went from 2.4 billion to like 2.85 billion, which is pretty good. It's sort of historically high if you don't include the Recovery Act. But on the tax incentive side, it was less encouraging. I think the paper that David and Elizabeth wrote, I think is looking at how one should use tax incentives. And I think I would agree largely with most of their points there, that this is ideally in an efficient market how one would use tax incentives, really targeted on getting the technologies to scale and bringing them to commercial potential or bringing them to the market. Unfortunately, as I think Elizabeth said, right now we do sort of have energy policy by tax policy. And in the absence of a carbon price, EDF is very supportive of extending the PTC, the ITC, the EV tax credit, creating the ITC for energy storage, for offshore wind, for building efficiency. And all these are necessary because we don't see a carbon solution, a comprehensive carbon policy solution in the near term. And so you really want to make sure that you capitalize the momentum. There are some challenges with that. One is that the tax policy has a bunch of quirks to it, right? Like if each technology is getting its own incentive, then each technology sort of ends up with kind of different specifications around it. So, for instance, the solar, the solar ITC remains at 10% in perpetuity, while the wind PTC ramps down to 0. And so that sort of can lead to a less than even playing field for those technologies. We also end up negotiating ramp downs in the PTC and the ITC back in the end of 2014, I think it was. But that was also done in the context of assuming that we would be making a lot more progress on a comprehensive carbon policy by now, or at least the Clean Power Plan would be in place, and maybe Paris commitments and things like that. And when you see the lack of progress that's been made over the last few years, I think it really raises the importance of continuing these tax incentives, even though they are certainly not the most efficient way to make progress. I would add also the boom and bust challenge that they mentioned. I think they have the ML graph that shows sort of the spikes in the PTC. That's obviously difficult from a market perspective. It's also difficult from a manufacturing perspective. If demand is going up and demand is going down, for something like a wind turbine, which is so big and you really need to manufacture it on site, we're not importing a lot of wind turbines from China, for instance. Losing the manufacturing capacity for a couple of years because of policy uncertainty or having to ramp it way up leads to a lot of instability, leads to a lot of increased associated costs that could be avoided with sort of a more coherent, stable policy as they mentioned. What am I doing on time? I would also mention that a lot of the discussion about extenders right now is around clean energy tax extenders, and I do think that I really want to highlight the point that they make in the report that there's a perpetual roughly $15 to $20 billion in incentives annually for fossil fuels, and that we talk a lot about removing incentives to create an even playing field, but I think that when you look at the way that the tax code is set up, there are some institutional biases that are in place, or structural biases that continue to incentivize development of oil production, for instance, which if we're trying to get to a net zero by 2050 target is pretty inconsistent. I think I'll end there and look forward to the discussions about this, but just to reiterate, I think tax incentives are an incredibly important part of our policy framework today. I think when you look at the numbers that we're spending on tax policy versus the number we're spending on R&D, I think that's a real problem. I think it should be, probably more balanced or reversed. But I think that's just the way that we're able to get things done today, in part because tax expenditures are a lot more hidden than R&D dollars when it comes to appropriations numbers. So, looking forward to discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve.
In the event Belfast and Western Face. Well, thank you. Again, my name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the Managing Director of Policy at ClearPath, a largely DC-centric organization focused on federal policies that accelerate clean energy innovation and deployment. And yeah, I want to touch a little bit, and as was mentioned in the introduction, I spent a little over a decade on Capitol Hill, finishing my time here in the Capitol, working for Senator Dean Heller from Nevada, who was on the Senate Finance Committee and played a pretty big role in the last big package of tax incentives in 2015 that set out the kind of phase out of the solar ITC and the wind PTC incentives. And I give you a little bit of kind of insight on some of the conversations that were happening at the tax writing committees then and how that's evolved over this period of time. First, I'll just touch a little bit on ClearPath and kind of our priorities as we look at the global climate challenge. We think it's an urgent problem, and as we look at policies moving forward, we need more of existing commercialized technologies, and ultimately we need a lot more in the clean space to keep up with economic development globally, and ultimately to reach deep decarbonization goals by mid-century. And so, I think we've seen a clear trend that existing technologies, which are great and we need more of, are not keeping up with global economic growth to meet the emission reduction objectives that we've set out globally. And so we try to work, and we think tax incentives and financing policies in particular are an essential part of that puzzle, and really appreciate the work that Elizabeth and ITIF did on this report to kind of take a deeper dive into the policy needs and intents here. One thing I'll go ahead and point out is, ClearPath looks at this from a sector-specific perspective. So we focus on the power sector, and we think that as you look and craft policies, it's important to look at the key drivers that deal with those issues. So we don't work on things like carbon pricing and carbon taxes, and have been working very specific on this kind of a complementary policy suite we think that is important to decarbonize the power sector. And so when you look at the type of policies, we think that it's important to have kind of across the commercialization spectrum, early stage research and development that kind of is the brainchild to bring the new ideas to something that is real, applied research to bring them to a demonstration phase, federal support in the energy realm to demonstrate new technologies, and then pull policies that allow these first technologies to come to market and improve their economic viability. I think the energy sector is very different than a lot of other sectors of the economy. It's a heavily regulated sector. There is a role for the federal government, albeit a limited role to bring these technologies to the market. Otherwise, we'd be stuck with the status quo. The fact of the matter is the way that U.S. electricity markets are structured. There's a disincentive to doing new things, and so we need policies like things like what Congressman Tom Reed has put out here to try to help to bridge the valley of death that both David and Elizabeth has discussed a little bit on that front. And there's a huge opportunity. As we just mentioned, the most recent appropriations bill, significant investment into the federal research and development engine at the Department of Energy. And we really would be squandering that huge progress without some of these later stage policies that are important to commercializing the technologies. There's a great piece in Axios earlier today that I encourage you guys to look at. Shows the trajectory of our D&D resources and shows that we've seen a significant investment, a $1.8 billion increase in investment in clean technologies since 2014, and that's a 50% increase. And so to ensure that we're good stewards of taxpayer resources, we want to make sure that the taxpayer gets a return on those investments, right? We want commercially technologies that are transformative. And as we look kind of historically, and that is how big breakthroughs have happened in the energy sector. We've done a big piece on kind of how the fracking revolution came about and technologies that were in place, horizontal drilling, things along those lines. And that was catalyzed by a public-private partnership with the Department of Energy and the private sector to bring these technologies forward. Demonstrations of those technologies, and then ultimately a $10 billion alternative production tax credit that brought it to market and ultimately showed us what brought about the significant expansion of natural gas in the U.S. and now it represents our largest source of power sector generation. I think as we look, it's really important to see what our policy intent is, and I think that David and Elizabeth's piece is really important in looking at the kind of different dynamics, both how tax policies have benefited different types of technologies across sectors, because not all sectors are alike, not all technologies are alike, and so we do need technology-specific type credits that fit. And when I mean technology, I mean buckets specific to the nature of those technologies. What's something to reduce emissions from power sector is probably not going to be pretty congruent with efficiency, for example, in buildings, things along those lines. And so I think that's a challenge. And nothing is more infuriating than the kind of the status quo that exists right now. So I worked a lot on the technology-specific credits, and even at ClearPath, we would argue that if technology-specific credits are going to exist, things like the solar ITC, wind PTC, 45Q, carbon capture credit, there should be parity among clean energy assets. So, for example, in this extenders package, we thought it was important that energy storage get access to the ITC. These type of credits are kind of aligned in a period, so the clean is on parity, and we can bring all these different types of technologies to the market. And retroactivity couldn't be more infuriating. In the end, when we're thinking about limited government policy, what is the role of the federal government to incentivize investments in new technologies? It's to do something new, right? We're trying to use tax policy to drive private sector activity to build new things that they wouldn't do otherwise. If we're doing things retroactively, we're essentially just giving a subsidy to something that was already going to happen. And so this boom and bust is not effective in meeting our ultimate long-term goals of driving different types of activities which are going to be necessary to reduce emissions. And I thought when I was on the Hill here in 2015 and it kind of closed that last deal, that might be at least the turning point, right? There was momentum around tax reform. There was a lot of different conversations. Senate Finance and Ways and Means had a variety of working groups to look how they could reform and simplify the code. We've since had another working group since I've left the Hill at Senate Finance over the last 2 years. We then, a couple years ago, did another robust technology-specific tax package. Some of those things can be beneficial, but I think we need a more forward-looking policy. And so I'm really excited about what Congressman Reed was talking about earlier today, and I want to touch a little bit more on why it's different than the status quo as a whole. And one, I want to say, Congressman Reed was one of our primary partners when I was still on the Hill, and how important it is that he is kind of coming out there and being proactive and putting these ideas out over the last couple of years. The tax policy space among Republican policymakers has been a little more dicey. Less folks have been willing to come on out of that. And Congressman Reed has done a great job of, one, throwing ideas out there, and two, making the case of how it fits with kind of a limited government technology policy and how it fits into the climate puzzle. No one of these policies is going to solve the climate problem, but we think that something like this can really help bridge the valley of death for clean tech. And so a couple things I want to hit on the energy sector innovation credit and why it's different and why it should be particularly intriguing to across parties here for the purpose that it's intending, which I think is a key point. Its goal is to help bridge and bring initial deployments of new clean technology to the market. It's not intended to be a long-term deployment incentive, like, for example, some of the technology inclusive credits, or things like what Senator Wyden has put out, which is a permanent and very longer-term technology credit based on carbon emissions. And so, as we look at it, there's a couple key components of it that I think is important and is helpful to capitalize on these investments in the DOE R&D engine and ensure that we're commercializing new technologies. One is, as he mentioned, it is based off penetration, right? So it is more or less a permanent credit, but ultimately is accessed by technologies as you grow in the commercialization time frame. So the first early deployments get the most robust incentive, and as that technology gets a certain market penetration, the credit naturally rolls down, right? And so, in our opinion, and that is the role of the federal government in bringing these technologies to the market. Help get over that valley of death, bridge that gap, ensure that we get learnings from doing. The biggest thing we can do for technology development once it gets to that later stage is building them. And I'll give you a couple of examples of where that is the case. For example, the Petronova coal carbon capture project in Texas, that was placed in line late in the Obama administration. There is now multiple different technologies that are looking to build the next of that technology here in North Dakota, in New Mexico. Already we're seeing as they're doing the engineering and project development, anywhere ranging from projections of a 40 to 60% cost decrease in building and construction, which is huge. Another good example in Canada, Boundary Dam, the proponents of that project are looking to build a second project called Sham, and they also expect to see that kind of 40 to 50% cost reduction. So it's important to help do that first build and show, because new technologies are hard to do, and we've seen over the course of time that you can see major cost declines there, so that's important. I think another exciting part of an innovative thing about what Congressman Reed has put forth and introduced here is it's more market aligned. So a lot of these existing credits, for example, the WIM PTC, has been a straight price per kilowatt hour, and so that has caused some certain market distortions in wholesale electricity markets where technologies can bid in at negative pricing. So essentially say that we can provide free power. The way the energy sector innovation credit is structured, it's based off the revenues that you get in the wholesale market, and so you're not going to have that kind of negative pricing scenarios, and it tracks with those electricity markets. And then I think that another key point of it is it tries to be technology inclusive towards clean, and I think that's the key point, right? We need, in the end, the public policy outcome we're looking for is to drive down emissions, and so it's structured in a way to try to bring a broad suite of new renewable technologies, new advanced nuclear technologies, new carbon capture and reduce fossil emission technologies forward, and I think that's going to be really beneficial long term. So I think I'll probably just close that and get to the conversation here, because I think we got a diverse set of views here, but a lot of alignment as well, and I think it'll be interesting to kind of go back and forth. So thank you guys for your time.
Okay, so we're just gonna shout. And let's see, we've got about 25 minutes left, so let's maybe take 10 minutes or so to talk. Do you two want to respond to things that maybe wildly disagree, but are there things that you want to say by way of response or comment on what's in German?
I can make some quick text.
What Jeremy said at the very end of, I think that the alignment and between the groups is exciting to see, and that I think there's general support for using the tax code, but using it effectively.
Yeah, I think we represent a pretty diverse range of folks across the political spectrum engaging on these issues, and just like Congressman Reed said, they're attracting a strong bipartisan support just at the Ways and Means Committee on these type of things. And really the debate is shifting here in DC, so I think there's a real opportunity. There are more people like Tom Reed out there and more voices trying to focus on proactive climate policy on the Republican side, and I think that's beneficial.
Go ahead. No.
Okay, all right. So, I think in a way, your position is closer to Jeremy's than to Steve's. But before I try to draw you out on that, let me ask a couple of specific questions. So one, there has been some analysis of production tax credits versus investment tax credits. You all didn't get into that in your paper, and I'm curious, that would seem to be when MIT did their big report on solar in 2015, it was really an indictment of the investment tax credit, and they argued for something closer to a production tax credit. Would that not be that's more incremental than what you're talking about, but would that not be an improvement?
I think, my experience and research would suggest, I think that there are reasons why the investment tax credit is more appropriate for certain technologies, like for instance, offshore wind being one of them. Very expensive, still very nascent, and would benefit from an investment tax credit. Production tax credit does have the benefit of being tied to performance, which I think that would allow for the investment to really draw performance forward. But I do think that there are differences in those credits, and sometimes more effective and better aligned with certain technologies. And the production tax credit has had some negative consequences, in particular the negative pricing in wholesale markets. So I think that continuing to evaluate and improve upon how tax credits are being realized in the market is really important.
Yeah, I'd point out, not all technology developers are made alike. I mean, in the end, you're looking to attract capital and build these projects, and so some types of different flexibility on how to finance them. A production credit works better for some folks than an investment credit works better for others. And so in the end, we want more new clean tech, right? So some type of new different flexibility to ensure that things are financed in different ways is helpful. I think to Elizabeth's earlier point on the investment tax credit on particularly nascent technologies is right on. And if you look at Congressman Reed's proposal, what he does is there is availability of an ITC in the very early stages of market penetration. So before your 1% electricity market, you're able to use an investment tax credit. And then once you start to show that you're commercially viable, the production credit is the only thing that is available to those technologies. And I think it gets to the point that it more aligns with the way electricity markets are structured here in the US. And you're valuing stuff that's being put on the grid, right? And that's really important.
I would just add, the production tax credit certainly has had some market impacts that have been slightly disruptive. But I'd make a couple points. One is that negative bidding feels bad, but zero is just another number, and if you go below zero, it's not actually, it's giving the market a signal that there's too much electricity being generated at that time, right? And wind is not the only technology that bids negative. Nuclear bids negative a lot, in effect, by being must-run, because there's lack of flexibility, being able to scale it down or up. And so negative prices aren't new. There is an increase with the production tax credit, though. That is. But more generally with wind and solar, because they're effectively zero marginal cost, they're going to be bidding zero in wholesale markets anyway. I think we have a larger wholesale market reform question and figuring out what we really value in electricity as opposed to just paying for energy, including reliability and capacity and quick start capability and inertia, things like that, that we need to have. Because also, final point, sorry for going on with it here, is that Jeremy mentioned how markets are structured in the US, and one of the problems is that there's not one market in the US, there's 9 or something, each of which has pretty different rules, and so that is a large challenge.
Yeah. There is a very interesting NBER article, maybe you've seen it, by Joe Aldi, who was the Obama administration energy guy in the White House and negotiated the provision in the law that you referred to, which gave wind producers the option to take it's not a refund, but a grant, Section 1603, instead of a production tax credit, because there was, as you say, not a lot of liability. And so he was able to compare projects that were developed using Section 1603 and contemporaneous projects using the investment or the production tax credit. Not surprisingly, the ones that in effect opted for an ITC used more bigger turbines and less land, so they opted. I mean, the ITC, the concern is that an investment tax credit leads to distortionary decisions, that you invest more capital because that's what you're being rewarded for. So it just seems like low-hanging fruit would be having solar, maybe not offshore wind, but having solar move to a production tax credit from an investment tax credit. Okay, another question for you all on your proposal to delegate authority to an executive agency. I guess my reaction to that was, really? So the R&D tax credit has been temporary for as long as I know it. I think it still is. People have been, OTA.
It was made permanent in the last tax, in the last tax bill, yeah, 2017.
Oh, okay. Well, for years, decades, it was temporary. Why? Not because that was good public policy, but because members of Congress, got a lot of campaign contributions from people who wanted it to be made permanent. So it was good to keep it perpetually temporary. So, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, particularly something like the duration of a tax credit being delegated. That is so fundamentally something that Congress would want to control. Are there examples of are there models you can point to where issues that fundamental to a piece of public policy are delegated to an executive agency?
I think there's a lot of stuff that's in the tax code that's in there permanently. But I think you put your finger on the problem, which is the incentives of Congress to kind of milk these things and play games when they expire. That's one aspect. And then the second aspect, I think, has to do with the ability of Congress to have the right expertise, both about markets and technology, to identify the technologies that should benefit and those that shouldn't. So the goal of the paper is to make this whole policy more dynamic, right? Roll off technologies when they mature and bring in new technologies when they reach the point, as Jeremy said, when kind of the engine has produced something that's potentially promising, and try to see if they can really succeed. And it seems to me that that's something that Congress just isn't nimble enough or expert enough to do. Now, I do think it's a aspirational goal. I'm not sure Congress is ready. I'm not sure Congress is ready to give up. But at least for the purposes of laying out what we think would be the best policy, and obviously there are some risks in delegation as well. I would err on that side if I was able to design the system myself.
Yeah, no, it's great public policy. My really is a political response.
And I would also just add that I don't think that we're suggesting Congress give over all of their rulemaking authority, but I think one example, and I think Congressman Reed's proposal does this, is that it ties it to, rather than saying it's going to be a 10-year credit, it ties it to some sort of market penetration.
Yeah. Yes.
That a agency body has a better ability to track and then roll off than going back to Congress to make that what seems like a slightly arbitrary, decision on time, price, those kind of features.
But similarly with eligibility, so the point about offshore wind is a good one, right? Offshore wind means something different than onshore wind, but we tend to talk about these things: wind, there's solar, but in fact there are different kinds of technologies at different stages of development within each of these categories. And again, that's the law would have to be as big as many laws are to kind of incorporate all of those nuances.
Yeah. Okay. Steve, I thought you laid out really well all the reasons why a group like EDF, very market-oriented, part of the environmental community, supports continuation of ITC and PTC, because if they're up against fossil fuel incentives, it's what we've got, where we can't be sure of this other. Can you envision getting an agreement among other environmental groups to support some of the sorts of changes that David and Elizabeth are proposing?
I think that the environmental community has not, so I'm relatively new to the environmental community, so I should be careful what I say, but I think that the environmental community has not historically been, recently we've been pretty pragmatic, I think, about what is within the realm of the politically achievable. And I think that we've actually been a little less dogmatic about what we should be striving for. And so I think that a lot of these, the tweaks that they're proposing would be welcomed by a lot of people in the community. The question is just, it's always sort of like the next, you end up being very reactive to the expiration of the tax credit now, and what do we do now to keep it going. And there are only so many opportunities in Congress right now to actually pass meaningful legislation. That I think that's why you haven't seen more of a push for some of the adjustments. But but I think that there's appetite for thinking about. Nobody thinks the tax code right now as done is going perfectly. So I think there's appetite to think about some creative solutions.
And I think it's incumbent on policymakers as we look and say, what are our policy outcomes, right? And if we're talking about climate and trying to reduce global emissions and reduce emissions here at home, that's different than trying to facilitate the growth of a particular industry, right? And to some extent, it takes a little bit of the politics out. I mean, the situation that we have today in the tax code, even in the scenario where there's disparity among clean, is a political problem, right? In the end, when I was in 2015, when I was working on the solar or on the ITC extension, we were strongly advocating for all the ITC technologies to get extended on this particular trajectory. And ultimately, like, you know, to be completely candid, the solar industry was a larger industry at the time, had more contract lobbyists, had more advocacy on the Hill, and when push came to shove in that last moment, when a deal was cut, like, they made a deal for themselves, and the other technologies got sold down the river ultimately, and that's why we've had to have two different packages to try to resolve even some of these things, and I don't necessarily hold that against like the solar industry. I mean, they're advocating for the solar industry, right? So of course they're gonna be protecting for the thing. They're not advocating for climate action, right? And so I think that it's important to look at these policies like outside of that tech spectrum and more towards the objectives that they're looking to obtain.
Could I add just, so as someone that was part of the environmental community for a very long time, to just add on to Steve's comment, and you raised this, but you know, I think it's great to see Representative Reed here championing something for clean energy. But I think you might find more appetite from the environmental community to have some of these tweaks and have the tax policy more effective and responsive to technology if you were to have a carbon price to underpin that. I think that sometimes we have these debates in silos, and rather than recognizing that we actually need both of these things to advance the conversation. So I think that.
Okay, and that's my last question for
Sorry.
Jeremy. Did I understand you to say that ClearPath does not get involved in the debate over carbon pricing?
Correct, we do not advocate.
Okay, so as someone who worked on the Hill for 10 years for Republicans, what will it take to get Republican conservative support for a position that is now advocated by, you know, the likes of George Schultz and, you know, leading conservatives?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen, which is part of the reason why we don't work.
And why? I truly think
Inherently, it
this
is in the
a revenue
Sure.
neutral party.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to necessarily like go and take shots at that policy and folks who are advocating for it. I'm saying I think for Republican policymakers, there is a very foundational thing involved there, right? Where it is you're trying to make a certain type of energy source more expensive and others relatively cheaper, right? And so in the end, when we're out and pushing, we're pushing for more incentive, more carrot policy, I guess is the best way to put it, to make technologies cheaper. You know, it is seen as a tax, as an increase, as a source that could increase consumer costs. And ultimately, like, I think there's just a dig in on that. And then to the political scenario, we're never gonna get perfect public policy in this space, right? Like, there's a lot of conversation about what a perfect carbon tax policy would look like, what's a certain level, how does it ramp, things along those lines. And then to your point there on carbon or on budget neutrality, there's a lot of different ideas of how people want to spend that money too. And I think you see a political process that dilutes the effectiveness of a policy when you try to cobble it together. It's hard to see, at least in the short and medium run, some type of political consensus to get to like a 80 vote scenario. And,
I'm so for 60.
Okay, let me open it up. Identify yourself and project.
Sure,
Yes.
Jeff Epping with Entities LLC. Does the panel have any insight on 45Q and the IRS clarifications as to the timing when they'll actually come out?
So we've been engaging with the IRS with a broad swath of both NGOs and actually including EDF and private sector partners who are looking to utilize this credit. I'd say we're cautiously optimistic in the like Q2 of next year implementation. I hope that moves up, but I'm trying to hedge expectations. You know, it's critical. in our conversations with some of the industry folks who are looking to utilize this credit, there is a massive swath of projects they're looking to move forward and deploy these technologies as soon as these things are clarified. And so they've got to get it done here, and there's been significant both pressure from the Hill and from the outside community to try to get it done. I hope that it creeps more into that Q1 period because time is running out. It's another one of those time-based incentives, right? You've got to be moving by 2024, and these projects do take time to build, right? So.
I would just add that I think our experience here does make me a little cautious about delegating too much authority to federal agencies, just because I think federal agencies do a lot of good work. They're not exactly nimble, so yeah.
But I would just underscore that across the tax incentives that I evaluated, this what are we, tagging it to, and the rules, the guidance was very important in terms of determining success. The longer, if you didn't know what you were being tied to, the tax incentive was useless until that was clarified. So it's a very important point.
Yes.
I'm wondering how you,
Could you identify
oh,
yourself?
sorry, Ben Evans with the Alliance to Save Energy. How you, and I guess maybe Elizabeth and David, this is more for you, how you sort of strike a balance between market penetration and technology development. Looking at energy efficiency, for example, I mean, insulation, for example, is not exactly a new technology, but it's not being put into the market at the rates that we need it to. And so, I get that the technology development is needed and you can transform the markets that way. But particularly when the markets aren't really taking into account the cost of carbon, how do you strike a balance there between driving new technology and just putting what we need into the markets?
I guess to me, this is about the right tool for the right job, and I wish I had made that point more clear in my presentation. I mean, there are different tools for different purposes, and I think for something like this, really it's about standards and building codes, and along with education of consumers and builders, and less about tax incentives for a mature technology like that. And in fact, one of the credits that Elizabeth looked at, really all it did was induce more insulation. And it didn't really drive innovation. So to me, that's kind of a question of matching the tool with the problem. Now, again, this perfect can be the enemy of the good, and I don't say we have to have the perfect mix or else we should not move forward on a policy. But in that case, it seems to me that this is really about codes and standards more than about tax incentives.
Yeah, and David, I definitely had a bit of a debate on this because the technology was there, but it just wasn't being adopted by builders. So it was kind of like, is this a diffusion? Is this a process innovation? Like, how do you really square that? But I do think that this is an instance where lots of the R&D is very important. The market transformation, the incentives being aligned with the beneficiary is really important. Continuous improvement is really important, and then the technology that is being developed. How are we going to drive heat pumps? Is that through tax incentive, or is that through some other mechanism? So
I also think just in general, defining maturity is one of the tricky parts of this, and that different markets are very different. Like I think Congressman Reed's bill caps out at 3% market penetration. While maybe that makes sense for the power sector. If you're looking at like transportation, I don't think 3% penetration of EVs would be considered sufficiently mature given the infrastructure needs, the charging stations, things like that. So you really do have to look at the market in isolation.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
That's a good point.
Yes.
Hi, Clay Bryan with the American Public Power Association. So we represent about 30% of electricity generation, and we are tax exempt. Most of our members are. So we don't have the opportunity to take advantage of tax incentives. So my question is, what kind of complementary policies, what kind of comparable incentives can legislators offer that can also be tied to market penetration? Because our members are interested in transitioning to carbon neutral, carbon free technology, but we just don't have the ability to take advantage of these tax incentives that are supposed to drive this innovation. We just don't have access to that. So what are those comparable policies that we could tie to the market?
Well, we haven't really looked into it, but I would think that grants are the solution. I mean, something kind of that comparable level of support, but just through, in the way 1603 worked for a different set of tools. And we see this for adoption of school buses and public transit for EVs. So I do think it requires a different tool, obviously, because you can't take advantage of that. And we know that going through the tax equity markets is very inefficient. It probably won't work to solve that problem anyway.
Yeah, I think there's two cases where we see, and I think you're exactly right to point this out. One, when these incentives do exist, having flexibility on transferability and things along those lines, so you can find project partners ultimately who do have the tax appetite, and then that provides access to low cost capital. However, maybe not the most efficient route. And yeah, I think one of the things you've seen, particularly with some recent public-private partnerships coming out of DOE, we're seeing a bunch of co-ops wanting to, for example, co-ops wanting to partner and do cost share projects and do some of those other deployments. So I mentioned in my remarks the next Petra Nova, so this project in North Dakota that recently got DOE resources that look forward to do engineering design is with an electric cooperative, and so it makes a lot of sense to move forward in that case. And it makes sense for folks along those lines who, it's not as easy to just transition an existing asset or stranded asset, and so it's kind of some of the low-hanging fruit for those partnerships to demonstrate technologies and benefit.
This won't make it cheaper for you, but I do think, I agree with what they're saying, but I do think there's an important role for looking at like the effectiveness of renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards at the state level. They've really driven a lot of renewable adoption. And just we've brought up a couple times the tax equity costs and the challenge there. Lawrence Berkeley Lab did a report looking at the effect of the cost equity acquisition costs on wind PTC, and they said it was about 30% of the PTC's value was just being handed over to tax equity providers, and that is so inefficient and infuriating.
Just to defend tax equity for like a half a
Please,
second,
sure.
not that they are defensible, but it does provide a little bit of oversight. You all are, because the investment community is at the table and part of the transaction, I think that it has alleviated some of the concerns that those investments are inflated or not exactly economically efficient. So if we are going to go down a route where tax equity is on the table, I think we would need to be sure that there is proper oversight, that investments are being structured in the best way possible. But I think that there's a lot of problems with that balance.
I think that market may be getting more efficient.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
for better or worse. Yes, this is our last question.
Yeah, I just wanted, I
Could you
wanted,
identify yourself?
oh, sorry. Chris Chapman, Honeydew Energy Advisors. I just wanted to know, converting the solar from the ITC to PTC, how would you then envision the role of the utility regulations, like not allowing for a solar array to produce more than 100% of any given building's consumption? So kind of if they're being incentivized to maximize production, kind of how would you see those two entities working with each other to kind of square the circle of where we're pushing that?
I mean, I think this is getting to the point I was making earlier, that the market was going to need to adjust. Solar is especially tough for markets to kind of take on. I mean, we've seen that in California, their struggles in integrating high penetration with solar. And I think you just need to have, I don't think that's going to be solved by ITC versus PTC. I think that's something that you need to look at, sort of how the market design issues. That's an unsatisfying answer, I'm sorry.
And I think it underscores, the flexibility, the nimbleness, like as the market evolves, we need to be able to transition to optimize for the best policy tool, but.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for coming. Great panel.